Hey guys, welcome to First Methodist Youth Online. We are finishing our series called Faith in an Anxious World. It's all about anxiety and following God in the midst of that, finding peace in the midst of that. This is week 4. And just as a quick side note, I feel like these things need some type of like intro song. So if you're like a techie type person and you know how to do that, hit me up. Let's talk. Let's see what we can work out. Let's make this a little more exciting, right? But enough of that. Let's talk about this series. Um, like I said, this is our last week on it, and the question I want to answer today is, what does following God in the midst of our anxiety look like? There's this great quote by Dietrich Bonhoeffer, who, if you don't know, was a pastor in the middle of Nazi Germany during World War II, and actually ended up dying for his faith. He's just a tremendous guy. If you ever get the chance to read any of his work, I highly recommend doing so. And he has this quote on freedom and relationships, and just listen to this. He says, "Being free means being free for the other, because I am bound to the other. Only in relationship with the other am I free." And I love this quote because it reminds us that as we navigate this tricky topic of anxiety, the goal is not to just sit on the couch feeling better about ourselves, like, oh yes, I feel the peace and joy of God, and you just sit there as being a couch potato, feeling the love and peace of God as you watch Netflix. No, our freedom in Christ is meant to free us into a loving relationship with God and a loving relationship with others. It's meant to unleash us as God's ambassadors into the world. But it's usually not that simple, right? I mean, the fact is, if we waited until we weren't anxious anymore to follow God, most of us would never get off the couch, which we have a great excuse not to do that right now, quarantine and all of that. But we're not going to have that excuse forever. So what does it look like to follow God in the midst of our anxiety? Well, to try to answer that question, I want to look at Mark 6:32 through 44. And through this, we're going to see what does it look like to follow God in the midst of our anxiety, and also how we might even find freedom in the midst of following Him. That so Mark 6, beginning in verse 32. I'll just read this for us real fast. So they went away by themselves in a boat to a solitary place. Now, a quick backstory of all of this: Jesus has sent his disciples out into Israel and the surrounding area, and they have been proclaiming the word, and now they have returned. They gave, a report to Jesus, and they are exhausted. It says a little earlier they haven't had any chance to even eat or sleep, and so Jesus is like, all right, let's get away for a bit. Let's get some R&R, get you guys back in shape. And so they leave on a boat to a solitary place, right? That's where the story picks up. But many who saw them leaving recognized them and ran on foot from all the towns and got there ahead of them. When Jesus landed and saw the large crowd, he had compassion on them because they were like sheep without a shepherd. So he began teaching them many things. So, I mean, already you can imagine this is like got to be so stressful for the disciples, right? They have been out in the field all day, and now they're not even getting a lunch break, right? I mean, can you imagine that if you had to like work your job all day, you missed breakfast, you got 3 hours of sleep last night, and then when you're supposed to be getting a lunch or a dinner break, it's so crowded that like the manager says, "Oh, we got to cut it. We've got to serve these people." So like you can imagine the stress level, the anxiety level through the roof. So by this time it was late in the day. So his disciples came to him, saying, "This is a remote place, and it's already very late. Send the people away so that they can go to the surrounding countryside and villages and buy themselves something to eat." But Jesus answered, "You give them something to eat." "What in the world, Jesus?" Man, if I was a disciple at this point, I'd be like, I'm sorry, what did you just say? Like, have you missed the fact that we have not eaten yet? Um, what, Jesus, you're not, how, there's 5,000 people here. How are we supposed to do this? And that's actually exactly what you hear them saying is they go, what, they say, that would take more than half a year's wages. Are we to go and spend that much money, that much on bread, and give it to them to eat? So they're like, first off, Jesus, you're crazy. Second off, have you even looked at the bank account lately? We don't have enough money to do that. But Jesus is not deterred. He goes, how many loaves do you have? Go and see. And when they found out, they said, 5 loaves and 2 fish. So, like, not even close to enough food to feed. Like, they don't even have enough food to feed themselves, much less this hangry crowd. Um, so, what does Jesus do? He said, the story continues. Then Jesus directed them to have all the people sit down in groups on the green grass, so they sat down in groups of hundreds and fifties, taking the 5 loaves and the 2 fish, and looking up to heaven. Jesus gave thanks and broke the loaves. Then he gave them to the disciples to distribute to the people. He also divided the 2 fish among them all, and they all ate and were satisfied. And the disciples picked up 12 basketfuls of broken pieces of bread and fish. The number of the men who had eaten was 5,000. So, what does this have to do with anxiety, trusting God in the midst of this? Well, first off, I mean, like I said, we can imagine this is stress level on par with like finals week that these disciples are going through right now. They are hangry, they are tired, they are exhausted, and then when they're faced with a hangry crowd, which is stressful enough on its own, Jesus, instead of immediately doing a miracle and being like, let's get some manna rain from heaven, Old Testament style, he's like, I'm gonna let you guys figure this one out. And so, like, man, they must have been popping blood vessels at this point, right? But I think there are 3 things we can learn about what it looks like to follow God in the midst of anxiety that we can get from the story. Number 1 seems obvious: trust God. We like to rag on the disciples because they watch Jesus perform miracle after miracle, but still manage not to trust him. And we like to think that, man, if we were in their shoes, we would never doubt Jesus about anything after like the first 2 miracles, right? But the picture of the disciples is actually a very realistic picture of what it's like to follow Jesus. How many times have you experienced God's presence or seen him come through in your life, but as soon as something goes wrong, it's like it never happened, and we go right back to worrying that he doesn't care or he isn't real, he's not going to come through. You get what I'm saying, right? Like all those doubts, all those worries immediately come back. I think that's one of the reasons why Jesus doesn't just immediately solve the problem in this story. He throws it back to his disciples. He's like, guys, I'm taking the training wheels off. Like, I'm asking you guys to trust me in this situation. And not only that, I'm asking you to trust that I'm going to work through you in this situation. And this is not an easy thing to do, right? But what we see here is that it doesn't take some world-changing moment for the disciples to trust Jesus in this story. They've already had all of those world-changing moments. What it takes is for them to actually just start trusting him. It doesn't mean the anxiety goes away. It doesn't mean that the stress doesn't go away, but it means that they choose to be faithful and obedient, even when the situation says that is crazy. And that's actually the second point, is that God is looking for faith, not perfection. Like I said, look at the disciples. In this story, they are tired, they are hangry, they're anxious, and Jesus doesn't see this and go, oh man, these guys are a mess. I better handle this. And instead, he puts the ball in their court. He says, you feed them. And it's not like they had just some warehouse of food stashed away. They barely had enough food to feed themselves. I mean, 5 loaves, 2 fishes, there's 12 of them. You guys can do the math. That's barely a snack. It, if you're anything like me, um, you think if you're anything like me, you might think that you've got to get your own crap together before God can use you, or you've got to have X amount of money before you can start giving some away. But that's not what God tells us here. That's not what God's shown us here. He says, I know you're not perfect. I know you don't have enough. Be generous anyways. Serve others anyways. He's saying, I know you've got scraps. I'll take the scraps that you give me and make a feast out of them. But you've got to trust me enough first to offer up the scraps. And so even if you're anxious, even if you feel unqualified and imperfect, God will work through you anyways. And again, it goes back to trust God. Trust that He will work through you if you take that step of faith to be generous when the world says you don't have enough, to be loving when the world says that you should just push everyone away, right? And number 3 is sometimes the best way to help yourself is to help others. See, the disciples weren't just worried about feeding the crowd, they were worrying about feeding themselves. I keep coming back to this. They'd gone a hot minute without eating, and they only had a snack, right, to sustain them, basically. And now Jesus comes along and says, yeah, take that and give it out to the crowd, which is a terrible idea because now not only is the crowd not going to be fed, the disciples aren't going to be fed. But look how the story ends. By the end of the story, each of them has a whole basket full of food. There's 12 baskets left over. I like to think that Jesus did that on purpose so that each disciple would have like their own basket. Now, the story isn't telling us to ignore our anxiety. It's not saying your anxiety isn't valid because other people have it worse. But if we look at the story, we see that it's when the disciples choose to give what they have away in obedience and generosity that they find satisfaction and their needs are taken care of. And I think the way this applies to our own lives is that if we can learn to take our eyes off ourselves, to see others and put them before us, you'll realize that some of those things that you are obsessing over aren't worth obsessing over. And as we begin to live like Jesus lived, we'll begin to experience the joy and the peace of Jesus in a new way. So those are my 3 takeaways from this. That sometimes we just got to trust God in the midst of our anxiety. That we can't just keep waiting for it to go away, but we actually follow God despite our doubts and our fears and our worries. To trust God. Number 2 is that God is asking us for faith, not perfection. God knows we might not have enough. But God asks us to be generous and to love and serve others anyways, and to trust Him that He'll take care of it. And 3, that sometimes the best way to help to help yourself is to help others. That when we serve others the way Jesus did, when we bless others, God will take care of us in the midst of this. And this isn't some prosperity gospel, you do X, Y, and Z and God will fill up your bank account. But it's choosing to live like God cares about you, that God wants to take care of you, and to let that confidence in Him free you to be generous and loving to others. So that's what I've got for you guys. Those are my 3 thoughts on this story. This concludes our series. I hope to see y'all in small groups, or if not, to talk to y'all at some point this week. I know this. I know you probably have a lot of questions about all of this. I'm sure there's some great conversations that we can continue to have. Be safe, be healthy, stay sane, and wash your dang hands. Peace.